Welcome back. This is week 11, lecture 1, which continues our discussion of Calvin and the Reformation movements that developed from Calvin's influence. The last lecture I discussed Calvin and the French. This lecture is on Calvin and Geneva because Geneva became the home base, so to speak, for Calvin's endeavors. And we'll be talking more about that as we get there. There are two readings assigned for this week. First of all, Calvin's prefatory letter to his Institutes of the Christian Religion to Francis I. And I'll be talking more about that next lecture, because next lecture focuses on Calvin's Institutes. So I could have, I think on the syllabus it's the first one listed, but it should have been the second one listed because this lecture will deal with his ecclesiastical ordinances, at least in part, which are the two readings for this week. Now, again, I've pasted them for you, or cut and pasted files of them in the module for week 11. So you don't need to worry about going to the syllabus and cutting and pasting the URL given there. They're right there in the module, easily accessible for you to read. I've also made a slight change to the discussion for this week. It's still the same topic in terms of comparing and contrasting Calvin's Reformation and the Reformation of the refugees with Luther's. But I've added a stipulation, and that is based on Calvin's prefatory letter to Francis and his ecclesiastical ordinances. How would you describe the differences? So I would like you to use those texts as a basis for the discussion, for your argument. And that will be, again, helpful, I think, in preparation slowly as we build towards the final exam essay that's there, which I talked about at the beginning of last lecture. I'll be talking about it again in future lectures. But just I wanted to make sure that that was not excluded because looking at the text analyses, the first one was on Jordan Quedlinburg's exposition of the Lord's Prayer. The second one is on Luther's address to the Christian nobility. The third one is on the 12 Articles of Peasants. The fourth one is on Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises. And really, Calvin should be there somewhere too. So I remembered struggling over this and what to leave out, and I wasn't sure here, there, and everywhere. So there's no specific text analysis due on Calvin, but these two texts are very central for trying to understand what Calvin was all about within the context I hope that I'll be providing in the lecture. That being said, then, as prefatory comments, some housekeeping issues, so to speak, as the proverbial term has it. We can now turn to Calvin and Geneva. There will be some overlap with some of the things I talked about in the previous lecture, but in this lecture, the focus will be on Geneva and Calvin in Geneva. And so it's all one part of the same thing, but kind of approaching it from a slightly different perspective with new information, and we go from there. So I hope that's all clear, and if it's not, again, as always, please feel free to email me and ask questions, post questions and discussions, and we'll get this all sorted out, I hope. There is the suggested reading from Lindbergh for this week. And again, as every week, I think I said I've suggested Lindbergh if you feel you need a more, let's say, concrete or traditional textbook account. And Lindbergh is very good on that, even though I think, as I said early on when I talked about this a bit in the first lecture, in my view, every textbook is bad. It's just an issue of finding one that is less bad than some of the others. But anyway, Lindbergh, I often assign when I'm teaching this course in person, teaching this course in person, in addition to the lectures. And I think it is a help. It's a different presentation than my lectures are. It also has genealogical tables of rulers. It has chronologies. It has an index and everything else. So it's a very useful book, especially when we get into the complexities of the details. And we'll be getting into some of those complexities today, just as we have probably in some ways in most of the lectures. So anyway, I hope that kind of puts this in perspective. And so we return to Calvin and how he got from Paris to Basel, which is how I basically ended, I believe, last lecture, with him fleeing Paris after the affair of the placards in 1534, and then going to Basel. He was in Basel from 1536. No, excuse me. He was in Basel from 1534 when he fled to 1536, the same year that he published his first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which again will be the topic for next week. So the question we start with is, how do we get from Basel, or how did Calvin get from Basel to Geneva? And the title of this first slide, after the introductory slide, is Calvin and Farel in Geneva. And I'll be addressing that as we go. Now, from Basel to Geneva. Calvin, as I think I mentioned, was in a process of resigning his benefices. He had fled Paris, saw the writing on the wall. He had supposedly his conversion, as I talked about in the previous lecture. He was working under the general guidance or supervision of Ortholampadius, who was responsible for the Reformation in Basel. And on his journey to continue to resign his benefices, he went through the city of Geneva. Now, that's up there, and Guillaume Farel was the reformer of Geneva, and the whole issue of the Reformation in Geneva had been going on for a while. I think I've mentioned in previous lectures a bit that Ulrich Zwingli, first generation reformer, was the first kind of Swiss reformer. He was the one who debated with Luther the Colloquy of Marburg. He was the one that brought about the Reformation in Zurich. And from Zurich and Zwingli's influences, other Swiss city-states, and Switzerland is an odd place. It still is today in many ways, because I think I've already mentioned there are three distinct parts: the German-speaking, the French-speaking, and the Italian-speaking. They're cantons, they're called. And the cantons are city-states, whereby a given city would control politically not only itself, but a significant territory around it. And a number of cantons had become Protestant, besides Zurich. And Bern was one of the major ones. And Bern was Protestant, was powerful. There was then a problem for the Swiss city-states, because in the course of the 1520s, their economy began to shift. And rather than trade primarily with Italy, they started trading a lot more with the empire. And given what was going on in the empire at this time, during the 1520s, they were also then open more to Protestant influences. And there was a debate amongst the Swiss cantons, and conflict. There was something called the Catholic League. The cantons that wanted to stay Catholic formed together, and they fought some of the Protestant ones. And that's actually how Zwingli ended up dying. He died on the battlefield at Kappel, the Battle of Kappel in 1531. It was a battle, as many of the battles at this time, that had no conclusive outcome. It was between the Protestant cantons and the Catholic cantons, and nothing was really resolved for the Confederation, the Swiss Confederation, or the Eidgenossen, as it was called, as such. And so there's still conflict, there's still divisions. Protestants and Catholics are opposed to each other. And that was an issue for Zurich, or for Geneva, because Geneva um, sided with the Protestants, and I believe I'd have to look it up. I'm sorry I didn't do that before this. I believe it was like in 1525 or 26, they expelled their prince bishop. Now, I think I've mentioned before at this time, and basically for much of medieval Christendom, most bishops were technically prince bishops, even if that was not their title. It kind of became to be how they were referred to later on. But they were territorial rulers as well as supposedly ecclesiastical rulers. Some certainly were spiritual people, religious people, even maybe theologically inclined or even somewhat educated people. But overall, the bishops were ecclesiastical administrators, part of the nobility, and they lived as the nobility. And so we do talk about the prince bishops within the empire. We talk about the prince bishops in the southwest Germany and in the Swiss cantons. And Geneva was underneath the prince bishop of Savoy. Savoy was the province in which Geneva lay. But in 1525, they threw off his lordship. They just basically said, no, you're no longer welcome here. We're going Protestant. Get out. There was a Episcopal residence in Geneva, basically a big castle, and that will come back shortly. Um, and they kicked him out of there. Again, another colleague of mine from graduate school, his book was had the title of Episcopus Exclusus, playing on that pun from Erasmus's treatise Julius Exclusus. But what it looked at was how did territories governed by a prince bishop manage things to expel their bishop. It's because Geneva was not the only one. And it's a difficult process. Also, as I've mentioned before, in terms of as a Protestants as such, what do you do with the church property? How do you reorganize things? And it really led to an administrative kind of mess. So, in some ways, scholars have said, and I think Lindbergh says this, that the Reformation in Geneva was first a political Reformation and then only later became a religious theological Reformation, because all of a sudden, politically, they decided um, to kick out their bishop and to join with the Protestant cantons, especially Bern, with Bern's support. Bern was bigger and more powerful than was Geneva, which also then later caused tensions, which I'll get to maybe shortly. And so Geneva is trying to find its own way. Um, and doing so, they kind of employed, so to speak, or were able to convince a preacher who had been active within the Protestant cantons, Guillaume Farel, and also in Bern, to come to Geneva and stay in Geneva and help with the religious reformation. Now what the bishop is kicked out, now what do we do? How do we go about organizing church life, parish life? How do we bring about the proper theological understanding to these changes? And we need somebody to help us, because the expulsion of the bishop and the decision to go Protestant was a decision, as so often, as I mentioned before, also within the empire with respect to the imperial free cities, of the city council, the small council, as it would be called. And so they said, okay, we need some help on the ecclesiastical side, on the religious side, on the theological side. And Farrell, you're the guy we'd like to have work on this. And so Farrell went to Geneva and started working on bringing about Reformation in Geneva, to make a Protestant city now Protestant in terms of religion and theology. He was working on it in any case. Anyway, so the story goes. That's what was going on in Geneva when Calvin actually kind of stops over in Geneva on one of his tours to resign his benefices. And this time, too, he was based in Basel, which is another Swiss city. and so city-state, and so he was in a quote-unquote safe place to do so. But Farel recognized him. He had heard about Calvin. The institutes were circulating, so they're still kind of hot off the press, so to speak. And Farel recognized Calvin when he came through Geneva and said, Calvin, you need to stay here and work with me to reform Geneva. And Calvin's like, no way. I'm fine in Basel. It's kind of a foreign city for me because it's German speaking. I have, my work to do. I need to do more studying. I do not want to get involved in church politics. Um, I don't really want to become a reformer of Geneva. Um, and Farel was very persuasive, though, even to the point of saying, Calvin, Jean, God will damn you if you don't. This is God's work. We need your help. So very reluctantly, Calvin joined Farel in Geneva after having been drafted, so to speak, by Farel, and worked towards bringing about a reformation of the church life, the religious life, the theological understanding thereof in Geneva to coincide with this political decision that had been made to side with the Protestants against the Catholic cantons, who were still there as a presence and very influential. So that was part of how Calvin ended up in Geneva. It was not a destination, that he looked to and wanted to set up shop in, so to speak. He was reluctant to go there. And Calvin and Farel worked in Geneva together between 1536 and 1538. I think maybe I may have gotten some dates a bit wrong in my last lecture. I don't remember. I have to go back and look. But the dates, I did check these. Calvin went to Geneva in 1536 for the first time for his first day in Geneva, and we'll talk about that very shortly. But there were tensions. There were tensions between the citizens in Geneva, the city council, and Farel and Calvin. Neither Calvin nor Farel had a seat on the city council. Their positions were very much at the request and behest of the council. And the citizens didn't like what was going on. They didn't like to be told how to live their lives. They didn't like to be told that they must reform their morals. Calvin and Farel tried by preaching, by teaching, and trying to enforce religious conformity with their positions and their ideals. There was a lot of animosity against Farel and Calvin from the citizens and from the city council, actually, too, at least certain factions of it. It's like, how dare they tell us how we're to live our lives? How dare they try to, tell us that we're not leading good moral Christian lives, which is what Farel and Calvin were telling their flock and their congregations and the city council as well. And so in 1538, tensions were reaching a boiling point. Supposedly, there are stories about how citizens in Geneva had even gone so far as to name their dogs Calvin. So they'd be kicking their dogs, kicking Calvin. It wasn't a term of endearment. It wasn't a name of endearment. It was just the opposite. I won't go into the cruelty to animals that was. But the point is, it gets at the animosity that was exhibited and expressed towards Farel and Calvin, being resistant to being told how they should live their lives and that they weren't living good Christian lives. How dare they, the citizens felt. 1538, there was a new election. Let's say the anti-Farel and Calvin faction won ascendancy in the small council, and they expelled Farel and Calvin. They said, get out. We've had enough of you. We'll try to figure things out ourselves. Get out. So that caused a problem. Farel went back to Bern and was still active for a while in Swiss reform circles. Calvin then, rather than going back to Basel, um, went to Strasbourg. Strasbourg had the advantage of being in a territory that was both German speaking and French speaking, and in some ways it still is today. It's in what's called the Alsace-Lorraine. It is that territory that goes all the way back. I don't know if I mentioned this. I may have in the first lecture or so, first lectures or so, in terms of medieval Christendom, to the breakup of Charlemagne's empire and the Treaty of Verdun in 843. It's in the territory that Lothar, the third grandson, or the first grandson of Charlemagne, received, with his brothers getting the area that became France and Germany, but he got this middle part in the title Emperor. And it was called Lotharingia, the region of Lothar, and extended from the north all the way down into northern Italy and so. But Strasbourg was in that region right between what would be France and Germany, or depending on how you're looking at it, France in the west and Germany more in the east. And still today, Strasbourg is French and German, and it's over time it's gone back and forth in terms of whose sovereignty it comes under. And so Calvin felt, at least here I have a refuge. And Butzer offered him to be the pastor to the French refugee community. And we'll talk more about the refugees certainly later in this lecture. But they were fleeing France, if you keep in mind, after the crackdown of Francis I, after the affair of the placards in 1534. Because if you were so inclined to Reformation ideas, you needed to get the hell out of France, because if you were caught, you would be burned. And so there was a fairly large refugee French population in Strasbourg, and so also it was already naturally partly French speaking. So Calvin had that opportunity, and since Butzer offered it to him, Calvin accepted. So he goes to Strasbourg to be pastor to the French refugees. Butzer was not French speaking, or not, I'm sure he could somewhat. Butzer is a very interesting figure. He was at the Colloquy of Marburg. He's the one I think I mentioned who said, future generations will laugh at us because the very doctrine, namely the Eucharist, that should unite us, is dividing us. He definitely was very humanist oriented, and was working kind of, not, it's hard to say. He's evangelical in Luther's sense, but not nearly to the extent that Luther was. He's kind of outside the real Martinianer. He's not part of the League of Schmalkalden. Neither was Strasbourg at the time. And so, but he's also not quite as, let's say, reformed, and using a term as it would be designated later, as was Zwingli and some of the Swiss. He was kind of a fusion in some ways of Erasmian humanism and reform with Lutheran evangelical ideas, and with Swiss Zwinglian reformed ideas kind of coming together in Butzer. He's been called an Irenicist. He's a very interesting figure, and in some ways understudied, at least comparatively. There's an edition of his works and things, but in the grand scheme of things, Martin Butzer has been not nearly as studied as Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, for reasons probably very understandable in terms of his influence and impact. But it fit very well with Calvin, with at least his sensitivities at the time. So he goes to Strasbourg, and there he is a minister to the French refugees. Now keep in mind, too, he is a minister pastor to a congregation, essentially. He had never been ordained. He never studied theology. Calvin, I think I said this before in last lecture, was self-taught. He was trained as a lawyer, but he studied and as a classicist. Those are his two fields. Classics, I guess, ancient Greek and Roman, and Roman history and literature, especially Latin literature, and then law, Roman law and ecclesiastical law, but particularly Roman law. Um, so he had a lot of catching up to. So all of a sudden, he's starting to be function and work as a pastor. He had no training, but he makes his own way. He's developing his own theology. He had his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which I'll be addressing more next lecture. Um, and so he had developed a fair amount. Now he also then by this time had experience working with Farel, who was significantly older, in Geneva, even though that was in some ways a failure, at least his first shot in Geneva, first attempt in Geneva. He did have some experience with Reformation and how to go about organizing church life and church structures and how to deal with the community, and also certainly principles and ideals for how a good Christian community should live. So he's working on that now in Strasbourg under Bucer's kind of oversight, so to speak. And he continues to work on his institutes, and he issues a second edition from Strasbourg in 1539, an expanded edition. And again, I'll be talking about this more certainly next lecture, but just kind of as an insight into what's coming with some of that. Calvin continued revising his institutes until 1559. And so it's a work in constant progress. And I forget when the first French translation comes out, I think in 1540. Again, that's another date I would have to look up, but I think it's about 1540, 41. And so he's actively working on this major work of his. And he's working, therefore also studying to work on the institutes. I mean, research goes, is not something that we do and then we just write something up. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process of discovery, rethinking, relearning things, learning new things, working things out in more detail. And that's what Calvin was doing with his institutes. It kept growing and growing, growing, growing. But we'll talk about that again next lecture. So as he's busy then in Strasbourg, back in Geneva, things weren't going so well. They had kicked out Calvin, they had kicked out Farel. They did not have someone to lead the religious and theological reformation of how to actually handle church affairs, parish life, and all those things. And things weren't going well at all. And so in 1541, there was a new election to the city council, the small council, and let's say the radical anti-Farel Calvin faction was elected back into ascendancy. And they said, okay, what do we do now? We need help. What do we do? Okay, Farel, he's kind of getting old, and that was also opposition. He had been here for a lot longer than Calvin had, but maybe we can get Calvin back. Okay, we'll leave Farel out of it for now, but we'll try to get Calvin to come back. So they send a petition to Calvin to say, please come back. We need your help. We're sorry we expelled you. Please help. And what was Calvin's response? No way. I've had enough of you Genevans, you pig-headed, stubborn Genevans who are unwilling to bend to discipline and authority. I'm not going back there. I'm happy now in Strasbourg. They said, well, what can we do? What can we get you to come back? Tell you what, we have this empty Episcopal residence, palace. If you come back, you can live in the Episcopal residency if you'll just come back and help. Calvin says, nope. So, well, let's see. What do you need? I bet you'd really like a really nice fur coat. We'll provide a really nice fur coat for you, ermine fur coat for you. And you can live in the palace. And we'll give you a good salary. Please come back. Calvin says, I'm not doing that. I can't be bought. So, well, negotiations are ongoing. What is there anything at all that we could do to persuade you or to get you to return? Calvin, and Butcher was talking to him, said, maybe you should think about it, Calvin. Maybe you should. I mean, it's great what you're doing here, but this is a big deal. So Calvin says, well, I'll tell you what. I have a document I've been working on for my congregation here in Strasbourg. And it's basically a guide to how to go about reforming church policy and church life and individual life. It's called the Ecclesiastical Ordinances. It provides a structure all the way through for doing so. If you will accept as the city council and adopt as the official policy of the city council my ecclesiastical ordinances, I will come back. And they do. So the small council got them, read them, and said, okay, we can handle this. We'll deal with this. We will make this official policy. Come on back. And so in 1541, Calvin reluctantly returns to Geneva. City council had approved and accepted and made city policy, his ecclesiastical ordinances. And Calvin began work. Now, what are these ecclesiastical ordinances? Well, you will read them if you haven't already. And they're more extensive than I can go through here in detail. But they set up the structure for the church. How is it going to be organized? Now, I have up here the ecclesiastical ordinances extracted from them and or other writings of Calvin. I don't, in terms of his explicit up here in the ecclesiastical ordinances, the marks of the church, they're there kind of implicitly in the ecclesiastical ordinances. They're more explicit in the institutes, but they're certainly behind the ecclesiastical ordinances. But what he sets up then is a basic structure, and that's just what I'm going to be going through here. And if any of you at all, you may not, and I'm not assuming anything whatsoever, but have a background in or still are in, but or grew up in or whatever, I'm not talking about current things, a denomination within the Reformed tradition or the Calvinist tradition, which in this country is primarily what used to be called the Dutch Reformed, but there's two factions of that: the Christian Reformed, or then the Presbyterians. You will recognize this structure very well, I think. It's changed a little bit, but it's still basically the same structure for those denominations that come from or came from Calvin's significant influence. We'll get back to that, and I'll mention Presbyterians later. Anyway, so offices of the church. How do we set up and structure the church? As I've said before, once you kick out the traditional Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy, how do you structure things? And with Luther, there was still the bishops. He kept more or less the same structure, just not adhering to Rome. And so Calvin said, look, we're going to do things a bit differently. We're going to have 4 distinct offices. All will be subject to ordination. So you have to be ordained to these offices. Now, ordination was not as such a sacrament. It was acknowledging their position. Calvin denied confession as a sacrament. For him, there's just 2 sacraments: the Eucharist, or communion, and the Lord's Supper, and baptism. Baptism coming first, of course. Confirmation continued, but not as a sacrament. Ordination was important, but not as a sacrament. Whereas Luther got rid of ordination as a sacrament, even though ordination was still very much important, but kind of kept confession as a sacrament. So that's one kind of distinction between the two. And we'll talk more next lecture about Calvin's Eucharistic theology, even though I think I've mentioned it in the past, but I'll be talking more about it again next lecture. We have the pastors. These are the what used to be priests, just in terms of the Presbyterian tradition. In Latin, presbyter was the word for priest, and so that's where that came from. But we'll get back to that later a bit. Not here in this lecture, but later on. But pastors, priests, pastors, presbyters, pastors, who are really in charge of their diocese. Dioceses still remained in terms of parishes, and parishes within a diocese, a larger structure, because it's a very logical, rational, legal structure. The diocese for Geneva was one kind of whole thing, even though they didn't really call it a diocese. But within that, you do have individual parishes, individual congregations, and the pastors. A pastor was in charge of a congregation. Anyway, within that congregation, including the pastor, who was kind of the big boss, you had then a group of elders. And elders, some ways, means exactly what it says, the elder members of the church, the oldest members. That's really what he's getting at is a small group of revered, established people, men, to help and guide the pastor and the congregation, to serve as kind of that intermediary between the congregation and the pastor, so that the elders would be kind of the ones to actually implement and enforce the new teaching that the pastor would be putting forward. So you have the elders, who are the outstanding members of the congregation, so to speak. You have the pastor, the elders, and then you had a group of deacons. Also, of course, for Calvin, again, this is all men. It was till relatively recently, all church offices were only held by men within the Protestant tradition, as well as the Catholic tradition, and on we go. Deacons come from the Acts of the Apostles. They were an office to help the poor, to people in need. A deacon would go out and help those people. And so we have the pastors, we have the elders, very much part of governance. We have the deacons, who would be kind of the outreach office, in charge of outreach, to go and minister to people who were sick and couldn't make it to church, to help people who were hungry, all those types of, let's say, social welfare, so to speak, the deacons were in charge of. And then you have the teachers. And the teachers were not the same as the pastors, even though pastors were teachers. Teachers were those individuals given the responsibility of teaching the congregation, from the adult members all the way down through what would at least what used to be called, if this means anything to anybody, Sunday school, let's say. How do we educate? How do we teach people? This is the real catechetical arm of Calvin's structure, are the teachers. Catechesis is simply instruction, teaching. And here he designated an office of the official structure of the church as teachers, whose job it was to educate, to teach. So with this fourfold division, we can see it covers most things. You have, let's say, of a given parish congregation, you have the pastor, who's the boss kind of everybody. You have the elders, who are the advisors to the pastors and enforcing the pastors' positions into the congregation. You have the deacons for taking care of people, helping people, also in the wider community. And you have the teachers, who are to teach true doctrine to the congregation. Now, that is on each parish level, each congregation level. Above that, then, in place of bishops, rather than having bishops, Calvin established what's called the Company of Pastors. The Company of Pastors consisted of all the pastors within the territory ruled by Geneva. So not only within the city itself, but its surrounding territory as well. Um, and this was needed um, to make sure that there was uniformity and conformity in what was being preached and taught. The pastors would gather to discuss matters of church policy, to discuss matters of church discipline, which we'll get back to, um, and to decide how to deal with problems and issues. Now, that was joined, that company of pastors was joined by what's called the consistory. And the consistory consisted of the company of pastors and elders. And this was really the oversight body. Now, as a footnote, I said I would get back to this, and I will here, even though this is kind of inserting it as a sidebar, so to speak. Part of the motivation to bring Calvin back, and I should have mentioned this in the previous slide, talking about it. Part of the motivation to bring Calvin back, to have Calvin structure the Reformation in Geneva, was because Geneva was in kind of a tense position. They certainly were allied with the other Protestant cantons and cities, certainly Bern, but Bern was kind of looking over Geneva's shoulder. And Geneva didn't really like that. So they're trying to assert independence over against Bern, while at the same time allying with Bern against Catholic cities and cantons. So they need Bern's help, but they don't want too much of it, so to speak. So they think if we can have a good structure to show Bern that we can go our own way, that will really help. And that's what behind their reason they accepted the ecclesiastical ordinances. And this is the structure that Calvin was proposing. So that brings us back then to the consistory, which again consisted of all of the pastors within Geneva and all the elders of all the parishes. So you bring together the pastors and the elders, and you have what's called the consistory. And almost as to be expected, there is a very close relationship or overlap between the consistory and the small council, the civic governing body. Why would that be? Well, who are the elders? Elders are those members of the congregation who are elected by the congregation as those outstanding, established people that you look up to and revere and will follow. Who gets elected to the small council? Citizens, the same thing. So we have this almost, it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but a very strong correlation between members of the city council, the small council, because the large council, council I think 300, as it was called, or 600, consisted of all the male citizens, which is actually an oxymoron because you had to be male to be a citizen. Calvin was not a citizen. He never became a citizen of Geneva until the very end of his life. But anyway, that's another issue that will have an impact later on, perhaps. But it's understandable that the same people would elect the same people to the same type of office of esteem and authority and power, for both with respect to the church and with respect to the governance of the city. The governance of the church and the governance of the city are still all one and the same. And this was important because the city council could really enforce the decisions of the consistory. The consistory had some weapons at its disposal, so to speak, which I'll come back to. But the city council could affect civic discipline, imprisonment, banishment, and execution. So, the fact that there's such a close correlation between the members of the consistory and the city council made, in some ways, for rather harmonious working and coordination between the church governance and civic governance. And that became, in some ways, the hallmark of Geneva and the Reformation of Geneva. And I'll talk more about that again shortly. Now I have up here the marks of the church. As again, I here's my confession that not confession as profession, but as like, oops. Um, I can't remember right now. I should have checked and I didn't. Whether or not the marks of the church are explicitly stated in the ecclesiastical ordinances. They are certainly there implicitly. In the institutes, um, they are explicitly discussed. And Calvin um, identified three marks of the church. And what's a mark of the church? Well, we know since all the way back to Augustine with his City of God. Just because you go to church, just because church is held, doesn't mean that is teaching right doctrine, that it's good, that it's valuable. Certainly, and we know that there are problems out there. I mean, a Catholic parish certainly is not really the true church whatsoever. It's not following the gospel. Catholics aren't following the gospel, according to Calvin. Lutherans, somewhat better, but still there's issues there as well. So, how do we determine whether a given parish or let's say a national church or a regional church, how do we determine whether this is the true church or not, or whether they're lacking and not following the gospel? And so it doesn't mean that every individual in every parish is that way, but as the structure, how do we identify the proper structure and programs that are being implemented and whether or not this is part of the true church? And Calvin identified three marks of the church. What's a mark of the church? An indication. It's not proof, but it's indication that where we find these three marks, these three distinct uh, principles, there's the true church. Just as Jesus had said, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, I will be there also. When we find these marks under the church, that's the true church, and Jesus will be present. And what are those marks? We have one, pure preaching. And by pure preaching, I don't mean only preaching, but the purity of preaching, correct preaching based on the gospel. That is the first mark of the church. The second mark of the church is the correct celebration of the sacraments, namely baptism and the Eucharist. Again, I'll talk more about Calvin's Eucharistic theology next lecture. Baptism, in many ways, for the Protestants, doesn't change one little bit from the way it always had been. You still have to baptize correctly with the right formulation. And also, it's all infant baptism. So that is essential and important. And we'll talk about later, I think next week it will be, um, with the Radical Reformation. In general, they advocated for adult baptism, but I'll address that issue next week. But for Calvin, as for Luther, it's infant baptism, the same way it had been since Augustine anyway. That doesn't mean that adults cannot be baptized, because if you convert to become a Christian, of course you have to be baptized. But the issue is we baptize early on. That's essential to wash away that stain of original sin. Now, to make sure that we don't add more sacraments or less, that constitutes the correct celebration of the sacraments, combined with the correct and proper understanding of the sacraments and what goes on there. Now, the third mark of the church, which is not Luther's view whatsoever, because Luther would agree with 1 and 2, the first two marks of the church. But the third for Calvin was discipline. Only when they're all three together, when you have a community in which, in a parish, in which there's the pure preaching of the gospel, the correct administration of the sacraments, and discipline. How do we live our lives? What is leading a Christian life? Now, again, this doesn't mean that every member of the parish has to be a quote unquote perfect Christian, Um, but there are guides to how to live, and that people follow those. That's the discipline part of it. And that so often has become seen as the hallmark of Calvinism. And I'll be talking more about that next lecture. But it becomes then this issue of how do we enforce that? How do we get people to live the best way possible? How do we enforce morality? That is difficult. And that brings us to the degree to which Calvin succeeded in Geneva, so to speak, depending on what the basis for determining success is. So that when John Knox, who was the reformer in Scotland, came through, he referred to Geneva as the most godly city he had ever seen. The most godly city. I have up there on the slide social control. There's a lot has been written about social control. Also in the late medieval church, the attempt to um, use purgatory and confession as a means to improve morality has has been seen at times, not uniformly, but at times as a means of social control. Social control simply means trying to control people who are within a social group. How do you enforce unanimity and conformity with the ideals and principles of the group? That's the problem. And social control means that the principles of the group and the leaders who are determining those principles can control what you do, at least as a member of the group. And when we're talking about Geneva, within not only a single parish, but Geneva as such, under Calvin, that included everybody. So, how do we regulate and enforce behavior within the city of Geneva? How do we bring about that third mark of the church? So that's an issue, the issue of social control. And it extended beyond church policy as such, ecclesiastical policy. It really went to the heart of morality and how do we live. And here Calvin went back to some of the same issues that he and Farel had tried to put into place. I have it there then too, discipline, morality. And one of the things we need to do is to do away with public drunkenness. Now, Calvin does not explicitly say you can't get drunk in private, but drunkenness is a sin. It's wrong. We have to stamp it out, and certainly not in public. We have to keep the pretenses up, so to speak. Um, he was not a teetotaler, Calvin, as a lot of people might have thought. He explicitly says that wine um, is permissible. You can use wine, he says, even for hilarity, but you can't get drunk. And even for hilarity, that's in the Institutes, actually. But you cannot get drunk. You cannot become inebriated. And we are going to crack down on that. So if anyone is caught being drunk in public, or actually, and we'll come back to this in a second, in private too, if they're caught being drunk in private, that leads to censorship and discipline. And discipline not in the sense of being disciplined yourself, but enforcing the discipline and correction, that other aspect of discipline. We need to make sure that there are consequences for behavior that is deemed not acceptable. And public drunkenness was one of those. Another problem was gambling. Gambling is now done away with. We have to get rid of public drunkenness. We have to get rid of gambling. Gambling is not a Christian endeavor. So we're going to shut down gambling. And then prostitution. Prostitution is not a Christian thing. We have to get rid of the prostitutes. And we need to limit and strictly regulate divorce. Calvin did not ban divorce. He did not say divorce was not possible. It just had to be for the right reasons, and the right reasons were, in the vast majority of cases of divorce, not the right ones. not the acceptable ones. There is a great book by Robert Kingdon, who was the scholar most responsible for editing and bringing to light the notes and the acts of the Company of Pastors and the consistory. He was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I got to study with him for a year. Um, Fun guy. And he also liked to throw out to us, the weekly allowance, or maybe even the daily allowance of wine for pastors in Geneva. It was like 3 gallons or something. It must have been weekly, 3 gallons or something like that. Also there's the issue of water and all that other things. So that there was, in many ways, a kind of what we might think of a relatively high um, wine consumption, even among the pastors. But that does not mean that they're all going out being drunk. So. And also, then, of course, the issue is, okay, is this wine? Is this, what's the alcohol content of the wine? And was it a lot less than the alcohol content is now? But forget those things. The point is that Calvin did not ban alcohol as such. He did not ban wine. He just banned the abuse of it, or what he saw as the abuse of it. And the whole issue of divorce was that too. And here there are issues. Robert Kingdon, who I was talking about, has a great book on Calvin and divorce in Geneva. And there are some very, let's say, problematic issues that Calvin would grant a divorce he did to people he knew really well, but not to other people. So there's some real issues there in terms of the execution, and Calvin was not necessarily as pure as he portrayed himself to be, or as people have often thought of him as. Um, but he certainly was uh, very much attempted to follow his own principles, so to speak. He certainly attempted to follow his own principles, and in so many ways he was. He was not out for profit or for gain. Um, and he believed in these principles. And we don't find him out there going to prostitutes or gambling or being drunk in public ever at all. But the divorce issue is more problematic for all kinds of reasons, as you can imagine. Then the question is, okay, if you have these principles, and there are others as well, but those are some of the main ones in terms of what constituted the discipline as a mark of the church, and what constituted living a Christian life for Calvin in Geneva. How do you enforce it? Well, there has to be some kind of a punishment. And the punishment used on the ecclesiastical side, on the church side, was excommunication, which had always been the case. We excommunicate someone. But in Geneva, they even went further. Excommunicating, what does it really mean? It means cutting off from the community. In medieval Christendom, excommunication meant cutting off from the parish community, from the ecclesiastical community, so that you could not receive the sacraments. So essentially cutting off from the sacraments. And that included too, I think I may have mentioned that if you were a prince or a king or emperor, if you were under the ban, if you were excommunicated, technically everyone within your territory was excommunicated. So that was that issue. Here, excommunication really went back to this, the literal cut off from the community. That had implications, because if you're cut off from the community, you cannot live in the community. People aren't supposed to talk with you or have any interaction with you. You cannot live here. So what they did was they banned people and expelled them. They said that you have to leave Geneva. If you're not going to reform, they gave them a chance to kind of reform themselves at times, but they could be expelled. So you have to go live somewhere else. What about my house? What about my family? What about my property? Well, you leave them here, you take them with you. You can't take your property with you. You can't take your house with you. You just have to leave. That was very scary and a problem. But that was the means that then was enforced by the city council. The consistory was basically the court. So if you're brought before the consistory, it ended up being a source of real fear because the consistory issued the punishments. Just as in medieval times, the church courts and the church would condemn the crime or heresy, but then the civic realm, the princely side, would execute heretics. Here we have the consistory condemning the people, pronouncing the penalty, and then the city council enforcing it. Yet when there is almost, I won't say almost a one-on-one, there's a very close relationship between the city council and the consistory based on the elders, there's no problem there. The city council does what the consistory does. And so it became a feared institution. In one of the cases that also that Kingdon talked about in terms of the consistory as well, the poor guy was banned by the city council and consistory. Why was he banned by the consistory? Because he was in a public pissoir. I don't know if they have those anymore. Last time I was in Paris, they still had them. Not necessarily all over the place. This is a place where males go in to urinate in public. And they're actually open. If any of you have been to France or some place that has pissoirs, you know what I'm talking about. They would basically, you'd walk in, it's like a canister like this. So you'd walk in. It covers you from like here to about mid thigh or maybe at your knees. So you can still see people walking by the street. It's, I never used one because I couldn't really deal with it, to be quite honest. But that was more part of life at the time, back in the 16th century. In Geneva, there were public pissoirs. And this poor guy's name, can't remember. Supposedly, he and his buddy were in a pissoir, and he says, those members of the consistory, he says, they're no more Christian than I am. He was complaining about the consistory and saying that they were no more Christian than he was. Someone overheard him say that, reported him to the consistory. He was brought up on charges and banned, expelled from Geneva. That's how bad it could be. That's part of the social control. That's part of the discipline in terms not of self-discipline, but of imposed discipline and penalties for nonconformity. How dare you criticize the consistory or Calvin? That was not going to be allowed if it was caught and heard. That instilled the fear. And that is what helped make Geneva this most godly city where people did not criticize the pastors or the elders or the city council, where people did live a moral life, at least in public. Not getting down to what was in their hearts, but at least in terms of their behavior and their actions. And it even went so far in terms of enforcing proper behavior, proper actions, and proper beliefs. The famous case of Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus was a medical doctor. He actually was we now would say is a Unitarian, or he's an anti-Trinitarian. And at the time, I'll be talking more about anti-Trinitarianism next week in the lecture discussing the Radical Reformation. And he was an intelligent man. I mean, was accredited with discovering the pulmonary circulation of the blood. I mean, the blood going through the lungs, and the importance of that. So, he was a medical doctor, and but he also had these kind of radical ideas in terms of what we would say in terms of the Radical Reformation. But he was arrogant enough, I guess, that he thought he could convince Calvin that he was right. He was a known figure. He travels to Geneva to try to meet with Calvin, thinking he could convince Calvin of Michael Servetus' own correctness. He was recognized, he was tried and condemned for heresy in 1555. So what do we do with a heretic? Calvin said, well, yes, he must be executed. He must be executed without question. We should just, behead him. That's a bit more humane than burning. We'll behead him. But the city council said, no way. We will deal with him the way we've always dealt with heretics, with a public burning. That is the way to also enforce discipline, to show what happens if you sit here and spout off heretical ideas or what were deemed as heretical ideas. You will be burned. Not just expelled, not just banned. You will be burned. I mean, Michael Servetus was not part of the community. He was not a citizen of Geneva. He was not even an inhabitant of Geneva or its territories. He was from outside, coming in there, caught and burned. And Calvin and Geneva received universal applause from this, except for from the radicals, but by the Lutherans and the Catholics for burning Servetus, to extirpate heresy, to preserve the most godly city, not only in terms of behavior, but also in terms of attitude and beliefs. That was what was going on. And was all of that social control? Absolutely. And it was necessary for conformity, uniformity, to bring about and affect the most godly city, as seen by John Knox, but also as endeavored to be by Calvin and the small council. Now, we have up here the Reformation of the refugees, because that is what was going on in Geneva. And then I'll deal more with the later part of the story later on. Again, and I think I may have said technically part 3 of the course, or not technically, but theoretically part 3 of the course, looking at the aftermath and the working out of some of these or solutions, both within the empire. Next week I'll talk about the English Reformation, and the Radical Reformation, and then with what was going on with France and things. So, the Reformation of the refugees. I had mentioned that Calvin was a refugee, that Calvin had fled France, had fled Paris after the affair of the placards. I had mentioned that other Frenchmen, French people, fled France as well. They went to Basel, Strasbourg. They went to Strasbourg, where Calvin was a minister to them. They also then, once Calvin was established in Geneva, started going to Geneva. So there started to be a significant influx of refugees coming from France in Geneva. And that caused tension too, because Calvin welcomed them. And that caused all kinds of problems and issues. I don't think I need to explain that, since we have our own immigration problems and issues here in this country. And so it was a tension. It was always a tension for Calvin and for the city council, because he was not Genevan. He was not even Swiss. He was French, and he was accepting all these French refugees. But not only that, Calvin always was trying to evangelize France. I think I mentioned this last lecture in terms of the Underground Railroad. He established an academy in Geneva, the Genevan Academy, to train people, to train them as pastors, to send them back into France. He would send books into France, and he would accept refugees from France to Geneva. And so that was his major issue. Now, the term the Reformation of the refugees was coined by my advisor, Heiko Obermann. Is not necessarily caught on universally, but what it gets at is these communities who were in exile, who were fleeing persecution, primarily French, primarily under Calvinist influence. And we'll talk about other disenfranchised groups next week with the Radical Reformation. But here we're looking at dealing with the Reformation in France. It's really a misnomer to talk about the Reformation in France, because, as we'll see, France never really reformed. We will also see later on that there were then pockets and increasing. So I showed you the map last lecture too about the Protestant territories in France at the time of the wars of religion, but they were never really established or recognized. They were never fully accepted. So there was never really an accepted Reformation in France. So that's why Heiko or Obermann introduced this term, the Reformation of the refugees, because it gets at the broader phenomena. Because also to understand what was going on in terms of Protestantism in France, we can't just look at France. We have to look at the broader diaspora of the French, so to speak, in face of persecution. And Geneva was one of those refugee communities. Another refugee community, in addition to Strasbourg, was in England. A lot of French fled to England and to London, especially, and that caused tensions. And that will come back again, if I remember, next week when talking about the English Reformation. And so there are these communities, French communities in exile, who were Calvinist, who were trying to persuade others to become Calvinists, who were not trying to hide their their beliefs, even as in France, those who stayed, as I mentioned last lecture too, they had to go underground to avoid persecution. And this whole concept of the Reformation uh, of the refugees was the idea of, again, this diaspora of living under the threat of persecution and escaping that, but being true to your beliefs. And in that context, Calvin's doctrine of predestination was essential because, and we'll talk more about predestination next week, next lecture too. But on one level, it's like knowing that you are living in God's hands, knowing that this is part of God's plan. That is, in some ways, the only way to get through it all, to handle it, to realize it. And for Heiko, this Reformation of the refugees was one of the major patterns of the Reformation. And this I refer to, I think he makes a very persuasive case. Talking about the Reformation in France is really a misnomer, but it's the issue of Calvinist influence in France and what was driving that and fueling that and spreading that. The refugee communities, from Calvin himself in Geneva to the others as well. Now, that is what we're looking at. And so when we talk about the types of Reformation, the Reformation of the refugees is a type. I'll be saying more about that next week. So for here, I'm going to leave the story of Calvin in Geneva here for now. We'll pick up what happens in France later on. And Calvin and then his successor, Theodore Beza, was very much part of that because Calvin dies in 1564. And that's a problem. And footnote, I will check. I will check before next lecture to make sure it was 1654. Melanchthon died in 1560, Calvin in 64, or Calvin dies in 1560 and Melanchthon dies in 64. I always get those mixed up and I can't keep them straight. And my apologies for that. I will make sure I get the precise date of Calvin's death for next lecture because then things change as well after Calvin's death. His successor is Theodore Beza in Geneva, and he carries on the tradition for quite a while, and also has an influence in France in the wars of religion, which we'll see when we get there in a couple of weeks or so. Anyway, that's where we are today, and then next lecture will include focusing on Calvin's theology as seen in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which I've already said was kind of the foundation in some ways in a work that he worked on from 1536 until 1559, and both in the Latin version and in the French translations. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll be back for the next lecture before too long. Thank you.